Hi, I'm Miles Saffran with Champion Briefs, and today I'll be going over the basic structure of an extemp speech. So with the season coming up, I'm hoping that this video can be useful to both beginners and the more advanced extempers, just sort of as a general reminder of structure. And I'll also be going over some of the most common pitfalls that I see in extemp, and ones that I personally committed until I reminded myself of just the general precepts of structure. So I'm going to be talking about introductions and conclusions, as well as how to craft points and how these points should be structured in order to best present your case. So let's start from the top with introductions. An introduction is the most important part of the speech rhetorically, simply because it's the first one that your judge hears. So you want to make sure that you have a very strong introduction, which should last about 1 minute and 30 seconds, and you can split this up into 7 different parts. The first part is the AGD, the attention-getting device. So as the first thing that your judge hears, the very first thing out of your mouth, this is important to get word for word. You want to make sure during practice that you have a great idea of what you're going to say with some precision, at least more precision than other areas of the speech. So what are you going to do with this AGD? Well, the first thing is that it has to immediately draw in the listener's attention. The second thing that you have to fulfill is making sure that it's topical. Now, when I say that it's topical, that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be about the noun in the question, but just the general actions in the question. So, for the purposes of example, I'm going to be using the question, should Scotland secede from the United Kingdom? So, I'm going to walk you through some of the more common types of AGDs and give examples of each one just to better illuminate the structure. So, the first common type is an interesting story about the topic. And for this research, I found a BBC article that noted that there's a city in Scotland called Dole, Scotland, that wants to become the sister city to Boring, Oregon, another city with a very odd name. So if I wanted to craft an AGD about this, I could say something along the lines of, not much has happened in Scotland since the United Kingdom took it over in 1707. In fact, one city in Scotland is so named for this pointlessness. Dole, Scotland, which is recently, in the most exciting move of Scottish history yet, sought out to become a sister city of Boring, Oregon. And yet now, with the referendum on Scottish independence coming up, it looks like Dole, Scotland may have to change its name, as the whole of Scotland's political paradigm is irrevocably changed. So right there, I gave you sort of an interesting story that was topical insofar as it discussed Scotland. The next type is something that's a historical analogy. This is played usually a little bit more seriously. So while the first one can sometimes include something humorous or some sort of joke, mine was sort of not that great in humor, but it did have some inherent humor to it. The historical analogy is usually played more seriously. And this is good for a little bit more serious speeches, because obviously you don't want to include jokes or funny stories about really tragic events like humanitarian crises. But in the case of Scotland, you can really go with either one here. So the historical analogy is just something that references a specific moment in history, not something general. For example, you can't just say, in 1776, when the United States decided that it was now an independent nation from Britain, it set off the question of whether independence would become a greater deal for more countries. Obviously, you want to have something that's topical to the subject. So the question itself is asking about the nature of independence. It's asking whether Scotland should secede. So I would use something, the first thing that came to mind, at least for me, was a quote from the Iliad, when Hector is pressing up against the Greek army against their ships on the beachhead, and someone tells him that a vicious omen has come by, telling the Trojans to stop. And Hector turns on the soldier and tells him that there is only one good omen, and that is to fight for your country. So in this AGD, you could talk a little bit about the idea of independence among a country, but more so specifically fighting for one's country, trying to gain that sovereignty. And it's unique enough that it gives you a certain baseline ethos that's important for many extempers, because by bringing up something that's historical or literary, you've already shown that you have a wide depth of knowledge, not just pertaining to current events. So there's a third type of example, which it doesn't really fall under the interesting or history analogy, but rather is just satire. So The Onion published an article today about David Cameron weeping and saying that Scotland can't leave him now when he's so brokenhearted. So you could say, as David Cameron made a recent public address to the British people, in which he told them all, while muffling through sobs, that he didn't want Scotland to leave, and if they did, then things would never be the same between the two of them romantically. Obviously, this is satire, but it cuts to the heart of an issue. So this is kind of a classic example of satire. I'm not the biggest fan of those types of introductions, to be honest, and I'll explain why in the pitfalls. So let's get into some of the pitfalls. that an AGD can fall into.